welcome all of you. My name is Michael Rodriguez Muniz, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology. I have the privilege of coordinating for the last year and a half the Race, Ethnicity, Immigration Colloquium that's sponsored by the Institute for Governmental Studies. It's been a great experience. We've had a lot of great folks come and give, I think, really fascinating talks, and I know that today will not be any different from that. This is our first session for this semester. We still have 2 more talks that are going to happen in April. So if you're not on the REI list or IGS's listserv, please do so you can get information about some of those upcoming events. And of course, future ones that someone will coordinate in late next year. I want to just very quickly, before I introduce our speaker for today, I just want to thank the IGS team, especially Ezra and Mary, for all the logistical support of making it possible for this event to happen, past and present events. So let me just say a couple of things by way of an introduction. So today we have Laura López-Sanders, who is the Stephen Robert Assistant Professor of Sociology at Brown University. As we'll soon see, Professor López-Sanders is a specialist on issues of immigration, labor, race, and gender inequality. Her research has appeared in journals such as Latino Studies, the Social Science and Medicine Journal, and the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, among other outlets. Today we have the fortune to learn about her new book. You can see the title here, Manufacturing of Job Displacement, How Racial Capitalism Drives Immigrant and Gender Inequality in the Labor Market. Please pick up the book. It's published by NYU Press and came out last year, I believe. And so very excited to be able to have Professor López-Sanders share with us her new book. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, and thank you all of you for coming here today on a Friday morning. Luckily, the sun is out, so that's wonderful. I want to start by saying that this visit to me is a little bit bittersweet. In part is because the sweet aspect is because I'm here in a place that I really fond of. I was a postdoctoral scholar here at UC Berkeley with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I have some great friends here, including Sibel, Christina here, and Michael for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. Now, the bitter aspect of things is that Michael Borroway sadly passed away. And the last time I presented this research here was, he was there. And in fact, Michael suggested the title for my blog, okay? And I was looking forward to surprise him, unfortunately coming here. And as you know, his book was the Manufacturing Consent, and he suggested to also tie my book to some way in which employers manufacture dissent, or in this case, displacement, okay? And so along those lines, the book actually relates to some extent to the work that someone like Michael did, and that it taps into processes of oppression and exclusion that ultimately end up segmenting labor markets and communities along the axis of race. And I extend some of these ideas with the notion that also these processes of exclusion are tied to issues related to gender and documentation status or immigration. And so what I'm going to be talking today about is the main story of the book with respect to an argument in which I make the case that race, gender, and immigration status are categories of distinction that are used to enhance or feed into processes of greed and processes related to capitalism. And I will guide us through this conversation by starting to tell you a little bit about what motivated the research. Then I will talk about my methodology very shortly, and then unpack a particular case that allows us to open the black box of how the racialization of organizations, which ties to processes of racial capitalism, end up informing the dynamics that I call racialized or orchestrated displacement in the book. And with that case, I hope that we can engage in a conversation about these findings or what kinds of reactions they generate on you. So thank you again for this invitation and for this opportunity. So in terms of what motivated this research, I started conducting this research as a graduate student here in California. I was at Stanford University, and one of the things that was coming out in the research literature, but also in the data that we were getting from the US Census, is that there had been a demographic shift in the settlement patterns of the Latino immigrant population. So Latinx individuals were historically settled in the areas that you see here highlighted in orange in the map. But what we had were what we call the traditional destinations as places of traditional settlement, places like California, like Texas, New York, Florida, and Michael's Place, Illinois, right? And so these were our traditional destinations. So you're very welcome. I want to be inclusive. And so, but what happened is that after the 1990s, scholars were documenting a shift in the settlement patterns of Latinx immigrants. And so immigrants were no longer just settling in these traditional destinations, but they were going into places that have not had a history of immigration or in significant ways. And so what you see here is what people were identifying as immigration is no longer just an issue concerning a handful of states, but it has become a national phenomenon, okay? And so that is part of what was motivating me to do this research. And I should pause here for a second. When you see numbers like, oh, this is 2006, this is too old. What I want to emphasize here is that the story that I'm going to be describing is data that while I collected in 2006 and 2009, I don't focus necessarily on an outcome. I focus on a process and the mechanisms that drive the racialization of organizations, which, as you know, is still pretty relevant today. And so I hope that I can make a case of why that is important. Now, I'd like to bring your attention to a place where I conducted my research, and that is the American South. If you look at this map, there are many places here where, in white in these counties here, where virtually we have almost no Latinx immigrants in those regions, in those areas in the 1990s. But let's take a look at what happens in the next 16 years. By 1998, we see places that didn't have Latinx immigrants already starting to show some numbers there. And by 2006, the year when I started collecting data, we see some significant settlement in places like South Carolina, the place where I focus on my research. And I incidentally did research in Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina, that tri-state area. Now, why is the South such an important place for conducting this research, okay? And I argue that, that it was important for two primary reasons. And this is a place that, Colloquium that is interested in race and ethnicity. And for me, I was interested in looking at what happened to the color line in a place that had historically been divided along Black and white racial lines. And now we have Latinx immigrants coming into this context, and what's going to happen with their integration. Now, that was one of the key questions for me. The other issue was that from an economic perspective, the South was going through a process of economic restructuring and reindustrialization, okay? It was a booming moment in the 2000s in that place, and if you read some of the earlier reports, you see that the construction industry was recruiting people very actively, and they couldn't fill their places, okay? Construction, manufacturing, meat packing, and all other industries were were booming in those in the South. Now, it is important to keep in mind that some of the reindustrialization was also related to the movement of some companies or industries even from northern areas into the South, moving away from unionized context into right-to-work states like the American South, like South Carolina, where I conducted my research. And so contextually speaking, this is important for the story that I'm going to be telling you. And so in this context, I just could not investigate it. What is happening here? And so when I started this project, or what became now the book, I wanted, as a sociologist, wanted to study incorporation from an assimilationist perspective, which, many of us fall into that trap at some point or another. And then I saw the light. And so then I started looking at processes of racializations, processes in which structures of oppression and domination end up segmenting or fissuring the labor market and organizations. And so initially I thought I was going to look at labor market incorporation from the perspective of whether people were advancing, whether people were getting better jobs or not. I was also very interested in religious incorporation, with the idea that if you think of the South and the phrase of one of the most segmented times in America is 10 a.m. on Sunday morning in the American South, in the sense of many churches are still segmented, or religious organizations segmented along Black and white racial lines. And when you have a population, a racialized group that is primarily nominal Catholic, and you look at a context that is primarily Protestant, the question is, what are they going to do, right? And so I've written about this and the process by which a place where there were only 3 Catholic churches when I was there, starts growing in terms of the way in which even religious organizations were recruiting and attracted Latinx immigrants into this area. Cultural incorporation was another area I wanted to investigate, and especially because I was reading some of the newspapers and looking at pictures where places would have a sign of Piggy Wiggly in the South being substituted by Compare Foods, and signs on top of all English advertising, and now becoming Spanish language cultural signals. And so I was really interested in things like that. But the main thing that really attracted me was what was going to happen to the color line in that place. I wanted to investigate, as I mentioned, inter-ethnic race relations, but also intra-ethnic relations. Again, context matters here. And what was happening at the time when I was doing research was not only the arrival of newly migrated Latinx people, but there was also another phenomenon occurring at the same place, and that was secondary migration into the region from places like the traditional destinations, California, Florida, again, Michael's place, Illinois, and people coming into those areas were not necessarily primary migrants, were not necessarily pioneer immigrants. They were secondary migrants. And when I talked to people, what they were saying, when I asked them, why are you moving here? And their response was, as you might imagine, tranquilidad, okay, tranquilidad. They were looking for tranquility, and not tranquility in the sense of just peace, but safety, okay? Safety for them and for their families, many coming from very crowded labor markets like Los Angeles or Florida, many coming from situations of violence, and they were convergence in this place. And so what I wanted to understand is what's happened when you have the convergence of multinational national, a pan-ethnic group, just to honor my friend Christina Mora here, where it's just people from Colombia, people from Costa Rica, people from Mexico, from El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, and at one point, I counted 15 different Latinx nationalities that were interacting in this place. And so the question is, how is this going to shape the color line as well? And so this is sort of what drove me to this kind of research. Now, I ended up asking a very different set of questions, okay? And let me backtrack here for a second. And I'm going to tell you why I went to the route that from having done some initial analysis and interest on incorporation and assimilation into this other dimension of racialization that the book has taken. The book is more than anything an ethnography, okay? And it's based on data that I collected by moving there, and by there I mean South Carolina, as a newly arrived Mexican immigrant from California. What I did was, as a graduate student, looking at all of these dynamics, wanting to go there and understand how is it that you collect data and the question was, how do you integrate into a place like this as a newly arrived Mexican immigrants, not knowing anybody in place? We know that social networks usually help people integrate into place, but in my case, I didn't know anybody there, at the time. And so I essentially packed everything I could fit in my car, had an all-white sedan, just loaded it with the belongings that I thought I was going to need for about a year. And I drove from California, from here, the Bay Area, into South Carolina in a place I call Jessamine, okay? Jessamine is the flower of South Carolina, so you have to come up with things when you're an ethnographer. And so I arrived there and I started asking people, what do people like me do when they arrive into a place like this, okay? And I went to places where I could find Latinos, and that was a challenge, okay? Because one of the first things that I discovered moving into South Carolina is that you don't go to places and you just meet Latinx people anywhere, where you go or where you think you're gonna find them. And I narrate in the book my first experience going into a place called Taco Casa. And I thought, well, Taco Casa, and I should have known better by Taco Casa, no, Casa Taco. But I went in, and what I found is that it was owned by a guy that went to Baja on a fishing trip that was a white American, and all this stuff was white and black. And I was, okay, this is not what I expected, okay? And it took me a while to actually find people that look like me. And part of what I discovered at the time was that the dynamics of settlement from a neighborhood perspective were not what I was used to in California, on other traditional destinations. The population was dispersed in multiple neighborhoods, the Latinx population, in part because of what I mentioned earlier, nationality, in class, and in part because of the conditions of the South, okay? You could live in a place with you could rent a townhouse for $450 a month, a newly built townhouse, without having to have roommates or anything like that. And so the availability of housing was tremendous there, and that was part of that want to have that tranquilidad, right? Wanting to have better living conditions. And so it took a little bit of searching, finding people like me, and one Black woman I met at Taco Casa told me that there was a place called, quote unquote, Little Mexico, okay? And so I drove there and I started talking to people that looked like me about where should I go and where do I integrate, or where do I end up finding a place to live. And so I kept a tally of the places where I was gonna live, and eventually I settled with the recommendations that most people were giving to me, and I rented a place to live. And then the next stage was, what do people do when they just arrived to this place? Since it was all, grounded ethnographic. And one of who became an informant in the book, Lucy, the first thing she asked is, Laura, do you have a job? And I'm like, no. Do I need one? Of course you need. I mean, if you're gonna be living here, you need a job. And through her, I got connected through a network of crews or groups of immigrant workers that end up moving from one workplace to another place. And so my first job there through Lucy, one of my key interlocutors and informants, was cleaning toilets, right, in offices and other types of buildings. And from there, I started working in manufacturing jobs. I really wanted to study the mill industry because it's a traditional type of industry of the South. And I wanted to see if the color line was really being shaken by having Latinx people being hired in the mill industry. And I did end up getting a job at a mill. And one of the key things that I kept hearing as I was going from job to job, and I had 5 different jobs before the job that I'm going to describe as the main case for this research. 5 of those jobs, I keep hearing, this place used to be all black and white and is now all Latino. Or this place used to have primarily black and white people, and this place now has many Latinos and very few blacks and whites. And I'm like, what is going on? As a sociologist, as you can imagine, this is ethnic succession, right? People are coming here, and this is the job market that people cannot hire others, the workers that they want, given wages, given the conditions of work. And so this is part of what guided me to ask these questions. And the key questions that I ask in the book is, what are the vulnerabilities in which I have a screen there and I cannot see it, but imagine what it says, that racial capitalism, and how is it that racial capitalism works in immigrant displacement? What organizational processes and structures enable racial capitalism? How do Black, white, and Latinx workers respond to racialized displacement? And what are the consequences for workers involved in racialized displacement? And how do employers get away with racialized displacement when large organizations presumably uphold principles of equality and integration, okay? And the chapters of the book tackle these different questions. Now, theoretically, okay, and I have friends in this room that always push me, you have to think about this very theoretically, and I'm not looking at Christina. And no, just kidding. So theoretically, one of the key things that I was looking at is, what do we know about replacement? Because as you see in the book, I call it job displacement, and this is an important distinction that I make, because what we know and what I told you before, when we think about ethnic succession of the arrival of Latinx immigrants or any immigrant group in general, we think about it as a way in which immigrants enter at the bottom of the job market because employers cannot find the workers that are going to do the worst jobs, and the people that used to occupy those jobs move into better positions in the job market. And so we've seen this kind of replacement, this kind of ethnic succession in multiple industries, right? From the oil industry, very common in the food industry, and as you might imagine, it's almost impossible to find workers to work in meat packing and meat processing. And also the garment industry and so forth. And so examples, and especially ethnographic cases, abound with these industries. And so, but I wanted to look at whether displacement was the same as replacement. And what do I mean by that? Displacement, we know about it from the perspective of neighborhood studies in most cases, where gentrification is what we commonly talk about, when one group ends up being displaced by another group in a neighborhood, but by structural forces. Redlining is what should come to mind here. And so there are intentional, engineered ways in which one group takes the place of another. And that's what I wanted to highlight in this book. Not about this sort of economic type of mechanism, but more of this engineering way of bringing in workers into in racializing organizations. And so, but I'm arguing that it's not just race that is at play here. There are other categories of distinction and vulnerability, like gender, documentation status, and criminal record in some cases. And so, from a theoretical perspective and based on what we know, I situate the book in the studies that discuss labor market segmentation, okay? And I draw from that clearly because displacement is not decoupled from replacement, okay? And some researchers have shown that very clearly, that the two processes can be present at once when when employers racialize organizations. Clearly we have learned that employers have preferences that are biased, and Waldinger and Lichter open a big road there in terms of saying, interviewing for the first time employers and asking them, what kind of workers do you want? And the response was very candidly, oh, we prefer immigrant workers, right? And part of that is the exploitability. Part of that is perceptions of being more reliable and dependable. Also, some ethnographers have looked at how not only employers have stated implicit bias or even open bias with respect to their preferences using race and immigration status, but in some cases bringing in immigrants and then starting a process in which they transform or racialize the labor force. Now, the most common interpretation of how the labor force gets racialized, and this is, part of what Victor REI talks about in his theory of racialized organizations, is the use of social networks. And Mary Waters describes how, in Black Identities, how the food industry in New York changed completely, or in many ways, by bringing in West Indian immigrants. Helen Merrill has looked at some of these processes and added a wrinkle into the process of racialization by via of social networks. And she talks about how the way in which social networks produce the changing demographics of the workforce, it happens also through intermediaries, that sometimes the people that know immigrants can bring them in, and that produces racialization or the concentration of a particular group in the labor market. Now, what is key here with social networks is that the mechanism at play is homophily, right? And is social closure. On the one hand, social closure meaning that people start bringing in others like themselves, and eventually the group grows large enough so the workforce gets racialized in that way. And there's another theory here that is a little bit older, and that this is a theory that ties more with theories of Marxism and the perspective that we have, on the one hand, an economic structure or an economic mechanism by which the labor force gets split within the same context. And by that, we mean that there are going to be jobs in which we're going to find immigrants concentrated, and another we're going to have non-immigrants concentrated. And the non-immigrants are going to be the expensive labor, and the immigrants are going to be the cheap labor. But what's important here is the fact that in this kind of structure, we find exclusionary processes, okay, in which immigrants become pushed out but the way they're coming into an organization is, again, not through that engineered, intentional activities of an employer, but by nature, by having immigrants, well, they come us by the intentional nature of employers, but not necessarily in terms of exploitation, but with the intention of weakening labor, conceptualizing immigrants or bringing immigrants as strike breakers, okay? And so what I do here is bringing in all of these pieces and trying to put all of these elements of the mechanisms that we know about and make sense of them in the case of the South and the way organizations were racialized by immigrants engineering the entrance of immigrants into the labor market, and in particular in the case of an organization I call HICAP. Now, to summarize, and I know this was a huge ride, and I apologize, but it's important. So in the manufacturing of job displacement, I investigate how light industrial manufacturing, I'm not making the case that this happens in all types of jobs, light industrial jobs, how they happen before a job gets degraded. And in this, with this claim, I try to address the prevailing focus on existing scholarship on industries with high turnover after the labor market has become segmented. For example, the stories on meatpacking and so forth. In the book, I also examine the pre and post hiring stages of the hiring process. Why is this important? Very important for two reasons. Why is much of the literature focuses on the selective process, okay, the sorting of workers into jobs. And I focus also on the post-hiring process. How is it that people get fired, okay? And this is supposed to be tricky from a legal perspective because it's a lot more difficult for an employer to fire a worker based on race or gender than to hire a worker based on categories of distinction. And so employers try to avoid violation of the of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 on the one hand, and on the other one, the cost of reputation, okay? Whether if they engage in active discrimination, when through discovery, they're found out that they are using categories of distinction in firing workers, they can get in pretty serious trouble with their clients if that's important, according to the scholarship. And so here I try to address the prevailing focus on hiring and recruiting alone. Now, lastly, the book analyzes job displacement from the perspective of supervisors, workers, and employers. And this is important because the labor market is usually situated, or labor relations are usually conceptualized as a relationship between employer and worker. Now, what I really want to emphasize in this book is that we need to pay attention to the structural inequalities that emerge when employers need to rely with intermediaries like employment agencies or individual supervisors or brokers of the labor market, both external outside a racialized organization and internal in an organization. And so I want to make a call for how employment agencies or temporary employment agencies are an important actor in issues related to labor market inequality, especially in processes of displacement, as the current and the dominant focus is either on worker or employer perspective rather than considering both sides. Okay, so I also, in addition to this sort of different areas that the research includes, I draw heavily, and I mentioned I move away from simulation arguments, and really found that I wanted to situate my data on racial capitalism, with its roots in history of colonization, exploitation, and the systematic oppression of people of color, according to Cedric Robinson. Also, according to Robinson, racial capitalism allows for capturing how race and processes of racial differentiation are central components in the construction of categories of distinction, such as class, gender, and in this case, the organization of economic life. And finally, this is from Leroy and Jenkins, also that inspired my argument. Racial capitalism helps us understand how capitalism works, rather than setting out to define precisely what capitalism is. And so I'm going to open the box, hopefully, with the case that I'll be discussing soon. My main argument is that racial capitalism operates through orchestrated displacement, which I refer to as a form of work racialization, where the racial and gender composition of the workforce is deliberately shifted through managerial directives, like I said before, by design, okay? This occurs as part of an intentional strategy, not by the organic works of the market, not as a passive result of preferences or unionization or even social networks. Now, this process is enabled by using intermediaries and brokers to exploit and control a targeted or racialized group, masking hyperexploitation and deteriorating working conditions with narratives of hard work. So culture matters here, okay? And by exerting control by exploiting workers' vulnerabilities, such as immigration status and criminal records. Now, how did I went about this particular aspect of the research and collecting the data? So the study draws from 15 months of participant observation and about 300 interviews that I conducted with white, Black, and Latinx workers. But the main data for this research comes from the work that I did as a supervisor at a place I call HICAP, the main case study in this research. And remember that I had started doing other light industrial jobs from the start. And as I was hearing, this job used to be all black and white. What I realized is that the only place or the one way in which I could capture the mechanisms and processes of displacement was by situating myself in an in-between space as a supervisor. And so I eventually worked myself to work up, if we can call it up, into getting a job as a supervisor at an organization that was in the process of displacing the native-born labor force with primarily immigrant workers, with primarily undocumented workers. Now, when I arrived to this organization, the composition of the labor force was primarily Black and white. And I walked around the plant and there were no Latino immigrants in sight. But they hired me to work on an 8-hour shift. And I collected data and jot down notes the way that ethnographers typically do. I wrote down, notes down in what supervisors call a production schedule. And this was a sheet with all kinds of runs that we had to do during the day. And I kept that in the back of my pocket when that was expected of supervisors. And in in breaks, I will go to the bathroom and expand on my notes. And at night, I will develop those notes at home before I started the next day of work in order to validate my findings. I also worked as a volunteer in a church. I gave rides to people from work and to their homes. I accompanied in their birthdays and did as much socializing as possible to really develop cognitive empathy, to try to understand their experiences in a deep way. In addition to this, to field notes, I've also used semi-structured interviews, data from these interviews from supervisors and workers and key informants. The data that I collected comes from 2 points in time. One is 2006, when I did my original research that I described earlier. The second data collection comes from a follow-up investigation that I did by going back to the field and try to understand whether the dynamics of the Great Recession of 2008 had shifted any of the issues that I had observed during 2006, okay? Because remember, I went there into a booming period economically, and then I went back into a recessionary period. Now, I've been promising that I was gonna get to this case, and so finally, here it is. So the plant, okay? And please note that the pictures that I'm gonna be showing are not from the plant itself because of IRB reasons and confidentiality and ethics. And pictures of people in these images are not people in my case, but they're just publicly available pictures for illustrative purposes. But if you think about the plant outside was a very calm place, nothing out of the ordinary. It was the size of 2 large football fields with a large parking lot. Inside was a very different context, okay? It was very chaotic. Parts were moving everywhere. There was a large conveyor belt that serpentined around the factory, and forklifts honking all the time, and people were situated in different areas of that conveyor belt. To illustrate how people were placed in the plant, this is what one of the main sections where I conducted observations look like, and I call it section 12. And I'm just showing this to illustrate how the activities of people require some coordination, and the parts essentially will travel through this conveyor belt. And for IRB purposes, I cannot say what we made, but in the book I talk about making air conditioners, okay? And so you will have the air conditioners moving throughout that conveyor belt, and people were adding parts. As you can see right here, we had a sort of a completed part, I call it a base plate, before it went to another team of workers. But the plant in general allowed for socialization and for some coordinate, but work tasks were coordinated. Now, one of the recent or relatively recent development in the immigration literature is questioning whether the notion of skill or unskilled jobs, right? And how unskilled work is a misnomer. And so people were saying, well, these are unskilled jobs, right? Anybody can perform these, and this is why we have this is why employers bring workers like immigrant workers, and so the jobs actually require a high level of skill. And if you see this particular job right here, it's the kind of a very dangerous job where you have a riveting gun hanging from the ceiling, and you have to be riveting pieces. And so if you don't hold this really heavily, your arm can get twisted and go with the into the ceiling. And so the jobs require some skill, so you could not just go outside in the street and pick up someone and just put them in place, okay? It requires some time to train people. There also, the jobs were not gender in the sense of men and women could perform the jobs relatively equally. I would say that there were about a couple of jobs that were that required lifting more than 50 pounds, okay? But in general, they were not gender. Now, wages, as we know, this is a key question. Where is the worst paying jobs, right? And I'm showing here just a couple of a few illustrative numbers. The minimum wage in South Carolina at the time was $5.50. If you look at the temporary wages or jobs for the workers that I'm talking about, they were $8.50, about 60% higher than the minimum wage in the area. And then the median for occupation in South Carolina was $10.57. So the wages at the plant were $13.50. So there were, I'm not saying that these were good jobs in general, But what I'm saying is that these were not the worst paying jobs in terms of the selection of workers. Now, let me just tell you about how I learned about the displacement process. And I'm going to read here from the book and my notes. The project required cooperation of agencies and supervisors. I learned about the company's plan the day I interviewed for the position at REI, the temporary employment agency. Talking in Spanish to me, Carla, a Mexican recruiter in her early 20s, described the position. She said, the company is adding a new project. They started with a team on third shift and then with a team on second shift, and now they want to start a team on first shift and possibly add one more on third shift. I'm having a hard time finding people to fill in the positions in different shifts. You know that many of our people want to work, but they don't have good papers. I mentioned that while I was waiting for my interview, I heard the receptionist tell a woman looking for a job that the agency wasn't hiring at this time. She smiled slyly and said with complicity, the company really likes hiring Hispanics. They know that our people are here to work hard. They like that Hispanics are always on time for work and that they're rarely absent. Hispanics are dependable and reliable, and the company likes that. Then she said they're hiring bilingual supervisors to start a new project. This is what we're interviewing you and other people like you. So essentially the agency was recruiting bilingual supervisors to bring in the workers, and they were sending away white workers that were coming in to look for these positions. Now, how did they get away with it is one of these questions that I ask. When I was surprised, and I opened the book with this quote, that on my first day at the plant, I was touring the plant and I was introduced to Dave, the general plant manager. And the first thing that he said when he met me was, hi, you're here to set up an enclave. And I was surprised to learn his use of the word enclave, because, you know, as a sociologist, I know what an enclave is, especially as a sociologist of immigration, but I didn't realize that managers had such a well-developed sociological imagination, right? And so he said that he later defined the group or the enclave as a group of Hispanic people working together as a team under the supervision of a leader, someone who can be an interpreter or translator, someone like you. And there was not a written document where they said, this is what we're doing. Clearly they knew what they were doing, but there wasn't a memo that they distributed telling that they were engaging in active discrimination. But they did tell supervisors like Roberto, and you see that in that quote there, what they were doing, how race ended up entering this process of displacement. And this is what Roberto told me. They told me overnight that I was going to start firing people, most of them Black, and that I was going to bring Hispanics to replace them. Now, the process was actually very open and very cold. And I used this vignette that I never liked, but it really is very much the clearest way in which you can see how these elements of vulnerability are applied in this process of displacement. And so the typical process for bringing in the replacement workers is illustrated in this slide. Marcus, the floor supervisor, asked that I order 2 of my people. I walked to the agency, the employment agency, and told Andrea, a young white recruiter working at the temp agency, that I needed to order 2 workers. Andrea asked enthusiastically, what is your area? I responded, systems foundations. She said, you want heavy lifters. And heavy lifters was a euphemism they used to refer to men. And I responded, yes. She said, you want Hispanics? Yes. Okay, we'll have them here by tomorrow. And then she said, thank you. And so what I was surprised is how easy it was for the agency to order workers on the basis of race and gender, and how workers were commodified and treated as though they were parts in the way you would use parts from the tool crib. Now, I mentioned that culture matters in racial capitalism, And the way employers orchestrated the displacement was by using strategic ambiguity, okay? When they talk about the displacement, they call it the project. They also call it the enclave. They talk about workers as heavy lifters. They wanted to bring them to at the time, at your own pace, you know how. That's what they used to say. They also use discursive imagery on quality. They call immigrant workers God-sent people, industrious, reliable, and dependable. And while this was true, what they did was to do it in the context of a comparison with Black workers. When they refer to Black workers, they talk about them as people who don't want to work hard, the lazies. They call them the crazies. They call them the louds and the regulars. And what they were doing was splitting right there, a wedge between workers, right? I mean, by creating this contrast in terms of the exploitability of one group versus the other with discursive imagery on quality. They were also not firing workers. They were motivating them to quit. And I mentioned earlier that this was important at the post-hiring stage of the process. And so they were not really writing them up, but they created jobs in which people will self-fire. Essentially, one of these jobs was cleaning with highly concentrated alcohol in a confined space. And so people were asked to wet a piece of cloth in highly concentrated alcohol to clean the units. And in doing so, they will get very nauseous, they will get very sick. And some of the workers that I interviewed told me they will be throwing up in place, and many of them walk out without completing the shift. By noon, they would be out of the door, okay? And so these were the kinds of experiences or the kinds of ways in which they were leading people to quit. They also transfer the liability, as I mentioned, to the temporary employment agency, that if somebody will come in place and ask them, well, you are firing workers in this particular way, what they would say is, no, we don't know the workers that we're hiring. We are using a subcontractor, okay? And the company had a subcontracting agency or a temp agency inside along with their human resources department. In addition, they had a preference for unauthorized workers, okay? When they have workers like Javier here in the picture, they will also try to get rid of them. And I go in the book in a very detailed case of someone like Javier that starts challenging the managers about the kinds of jobs that they're giving him, and he challenges the managers by saying, I'm not illegal. I know what you're doing. And what happened to Javier is that he was sent to clean with alcohol, and as you might imagine, the idea was to fire someone like him. Now, just to wrap this up so that we have time for conversation, when I started the project, and when I arrived at this plant, the composition of the labor force was primarily Black and white, as I show here. Within 2 months, the composition of the workforce or the process of racialization had already taken place. There were some Latinx men already being hired. And had the company go in that direction, this is what we would have expected, right? That a displacement would take place with a composition that looked a lot like that, right? With Latinx individuals being the primary workforce, with some Black workers and some white workers. But what happened was an interesting puzzle, that rather than the company changing to having mainly Latinx men, it changed in their direction of having mainly Latina women. And so the book goes into how is it that happens, okay? And so one of the main things that I argue is that in part women like Ramona here did not have a lot of options outside of this organization, okay? The jobs in this particular ecology were gender as well, not just racialized. So while Latinx men could go into construction, women like Ramona would not be able to move as easily. So essentially they were trapped or stuck in these jobs, okay? Now, similarly, I know that Black men had started when the company was hiring the worst of someone like Darius, anybody who applied. And for many of them, the cost of moving to other jobs would have been very high. They could not just horizontally move to other positions because they will be placed as temporary workers. Darius is a case that I describe about workers that had a criminal record that were concerned that they were not going to be able to get hired anywhere else, okay? And so here gender was related to legal status and to criminal records, legal status affecting immigrant women more so than Black men. But there were moments of resistance in which workers tried to do what they could to not accept employers' demands. Unfortunately, their situation was not very favorable, okay? And what they did was jeopardize the opportunities for immigrant workers to show their efficiency, to show that they were superior workers, and they were blocking their activities in order to show that they were not the hireable workers that employers wanted. And so here you see quotes from one of the Latinx workers talking about how they've been, their activities were jeopardized and derailed, creating gaps on the line that ended up affecting the process of displacement. And so that slowed that down a little bit. Now, what I finally argue is that, and I'm probably gonna just move quickly with some of my conclusions because I do want us to have time for conversation. But I noted that in this particular case, I'm showing a situation in which companies are being racialized by changing the demographic composition of the labor force. And we have gender and racial dynamics that are at play. There are issues related to power and resistance, but the resistance, similar to what Michael Boroway found, it was tacit resistance, okay? Because workers were afraid of losing their jobs. Social networks do play a role, but not to the way in which we know they play a role, okay? It wasn't until a workplace has changed when social networks start having an effect. But what I'm arguing is that what we see here is a case of racialized orchestrated displacement that fits within the rubrics of racial capitalism. The book also talks about how communities, not only organizations, end up playing a role in the way displacement happens. And this is something that I really wanted to highlight, as most studies on ethnic succession and displacement focus on the labor market itself. I argue that we cannot decouple the dynamics of workplaces with the dynamics of a community. And I used the data from my movement back in 2009 and from my investigation of the immigrant marches of 2006 and how those generated a backlash for immigrants that essentially terminated the relationship that they had built with employers, and at least during that period. When I went back in 2009, what I found were ghost towns, essentially, because the community had turned against immigrants. Just to conclude, why is this important? I argue that immigrant exploitation and discrimination continues to be a significant barrier to mobility and integration. Organizational racialization is linked to capitalist actions and institutional processes that generate inequality based in intersecting categories. And I try to be as nuanced as possible here, looking at gender and immigration status. And I also argue that the dynamics of new immigrant destinations can be replicated as new regions become tomorrow's new destinations. And I think that some of these processes, as places all over the world are incorporating immigrants, might go through processes that are similar to this. Now, it's important to establish the limitations of this kind of argument. Orchestrated job displacement, I argue, occurs when employers can transfer liability to agencies, when there's a vulnerable replacement workforce available to them, when economic conditions exist that provide options for at least some workers to exit the workplace and pull them out of these organizations, but it is possibly limited to historically Black and white contexts and to jobs that are precarious, and more importantly, to non-union labor contexts. But I don't know. I did this research in a place that was a right-to-work state. So the study provides clear evidence of a process where immigrant workers systematically introduced as exploitable and vulnerable. They're used to substitute rather than complement workers by design, okay? Ethnic displacement is not a byproduct of hiring processes. It is the direct result of the strategic and concerted efforts of employers, and is not a race-neutral replacement as in studies of ethnic segmentation or ethnic succession. It is a racialized, capitalist-driven strategy to extract more work and control the workforce using categories of distinction, such as race, gender, and legal status. And I'm gonna stop right here, and thank you for your attention.
So we have about 20 minutes, a little less than 20 minutes. If people have questions, comments.
Well, first of all, thank you. Excellent presentation. I just want to preface this by saying I've been living for a decade in Costa Rica, and I've been here a week now. And with this just week, I just realized how different the ethnic dynamics are. I mean, they're similar but different. And I'll just give one example. Yesterday I went to a talk, and someone who identified as indigenous, if I were to go with her to Costa Rica to Acabecar, Runca, Gribri community, no one would see her as indigenous. She was quite light-skinned, tall, very European-looking. But she identified, and that's her right. I was wondering, because Costa Rica has about a quarter people of African descent. In fact, they just played Belly Galaxy the other day at Elia. And you talk to most of the players, yeah, the Black players, yeah, I'm Black, but I'm equal. And most of them don't speak English. So did you ever encounter an Afro-Hispanic, and where would he or she fit in? Would she be side with the Blacks, or would she be with Hispanics? I mean, how do they fit in?
No, that's a great question. Thank you. More on the indigenous side, that Afro-Latinx. And so there were a couple of workers that I interviewed that were more with that what you would call Afro-Latinx. They did not identify themselves as Afro-Latinx, but if you were to classify them, you would say that was their descent. They were primarily from the southern regions of Mexico, Oaxaca, but the category of vulnerability in terms of that ranking would be more along indigenous lines, and I do have. In the book, I talk about a community that was of Mayan descent, that were Shuk speaking, and unfortunately, they were the ones that were hit the hardest. In part is because they didn't speak Spanish, and much of that brokerage that I talk about was mediated in Spanish. And so they were kind of an outsider group within the outsider group. It was a compounded disadvantage for that group, and more so women, because they not only didn't speak Spanish, but they also their literacy levels for them were lower than the men from the same community, And so the community leaders there were starting to work on an educational initiative, and that was part of what I did when I went back, work on some efforts to create educational opportunities for women in the Shuk from the Mayan community. But when it came down to employment, they were very marginalized. Okay, and so and most of them ended up working in the lowest paying jobs, like meatpacking plants, and they were charged to get those jobs as well. There would be people who would charge them about $200 in order to place them. So when you have that situation from a structural perspective, it really disadvantages them. Now, with respect to Ticos, we're a large group in my study, okay? A large migration from Costa Ricans into South Carolina. And they tended not to work in factory jobs for the most part, mainly finding jobs in construction, but back to the question of Afro Latinx individuals, the way it ended up playing out in some of the social relations at work was that there was a preference that a process of sexualizing those women in the labor market context. Okay, some of the male workers, especially African American men, were wanting to date them, and in part, they would ask me, is she Mexican? What nationality is she? Because she doesn't look like the other Mexican workers here. And they use the term Mexican or Spanish very loosely to refer to most Latinx people. But I don't have that many cases, but the few that I have ended up being women who were sexualized in some cases. Mm-hmm. But thank you for that question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank
It's so nice to see you here. Towards the end, I think you went over this really quickly, like maybe it was your last empirical slide where you say that you revisited and then somehow the workforce switched back to Black and immigrant after the marches, things like that. Can you talk a little bit more about how immigrant backlash, and then I wonder then how you think of that switch back in relationship to sort of broad arguments about racial capitalism?
Thank you. That's a great question. So when I went back, before I went back, because I went back in 2009, when I was there in 2006, almost in the middle of my field work at this HICAP, the immigrant marches happened, right? And so people were taking, immigrant workers were in the streets, and one of the, as you know, most significant social movements we've seen in recent history from an immigration perspective. And after possibly a week after, we have an anti-immigrant backlash with what I mentioned, the Council of Citizens, and what they did was eventually doing counter marches that would be mitigating some of the efforts of Latino immigrants. And the way I talk about it in the book is that rather than helping immigrants, it actually damaged their relationships or potential allies in the factory. And some people that were not aware of the immigration status of some of the workers became aware of and became much more conscientious, or if we can call it conscientious, but much more aware that the factory was hiring immigrant workers. And so they were, starting to ask, is this person immigrant? Does this person has a green card? And before the marches, they were not asking those kinds of questions. And so what it created was that awareness and that sort of sense that it was a violation of the law, in essence, from a legal perspective. Now, what that did was, with that awareness, some of the people that were there more in a supervisory or managerial position became also very concerned, right? That once the workers knew that they will have consequences for them. And so when I went back in 2009, I talked to some of the people that I had interviewed before, and about how were the dynamics in the plant, and they said, the company got rid of a lot of the workers. People were talking about how they were about their documentation status, and it was not just that, because there were also some other elements, like factory rates got much more enhanced. There was the implementation of E-Verify. So nothing like this happens in a vacuum, right? Now, it is not just what's happening in the streets, but in terms of the social movements and the counter movements, but also what was happening at the national level. And so what the company shifted at that point, and it started bringing in immigrants of other nationalities. And so rather than hiring immigrants from Latin America, they started hiring immigrants from Haiti and Jamaica. And so what I was told by employment agency staff is that the factory was now Black, but Black immigrant, right? That it had what we see possibly in Mary Waters' type of study. And so I think that, my argument is that these are processes that are constantly shifting, right? And they're really dependent on more than just employment dynamics. That they're tied to the political process and political elements, and that workers shift and get very creative in terms of how is it that they're going to implement racialization and exclusion. And for them, it's just commoditization. It's like, what group do I bring in, right? So I don't know if that answers. Excuse me.
A few minutes, question?
So thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I think your research was primarily focusing on workers who are working in a plant factory. I'm wondering if you have done research, or you're aware of research done on certain other jobs where people don't work in a factory, but they still people find jobs through a network of peers. I'm particularly referring to jobs like being a nanny or a babysitter. People don't necessarily work in a factory, but they still I'm aware that there are certain WhatsApp groups for people, and then when a new immigrant arrives, he or she is usually added to that WhatsApp group, and then people refer him or her to families who are in need of a babysitter. And I've noticed, because I do work with a lot of immigrant students, people who are here on an F1 visa, and for some reason they're seeking employment. And most of the time they are desperately looking for work, but because they're afraid of violating their F1 visa status, they do it through friends or family, those WhatsApp groups. Are you aware of any research being done on those particular types of jobs, and whether or not there has been a shift towards employing people who are bilingual and can speak Spanish as well, because families want their kids to be taken care of by a person who's bilingual and can teach their kids both English and Spanish as well?
No, and well, there is certainly a literature on earlier studies like Cecilia Mejiver's work, in terms of housework. And you're talking about technology, and that's an interesting angle there. How is it that technology is now enabling the social network effect or the social closure effect? And so that there's some research developing in that area. But what there mostly is, immigrant workers learning about jobs through with family members, kin. That is, one way in which a lot of them get connected, not necessarily through employment agencies or brokers, right? Usually, but what you're describing is the connection of, for example, non-Spanish speaking or non-immigrant families with families that need that service. And that, I think that there is some research, but not as specifically framed from a racial perspective in the way if you're thinking about it in those terms, in the sense of, white families hiring non-white immigrants or Spanish speaking as a proxy for non-white to benefit themselves. I'm not sure of anything other than the fact that people do get jobs through networks, right? And that's very common. One thing that I am very interested in right now is technology. And so my new research actually focuses on what happens when you remove the intermediaries, okay? When you actually don't have anybody to connect you but a platform, right? And so I'm looking at the gig economy and people who are doing delivery jobs that are not able to do it with other kinds of visas or without a visa, right? And so, and you do it, in ways in which your permit might allow you to do it, or with family members, but jobs like Uber or Lyft are also a new area in which many immigrants are connected into jobs without necessarily introducing an intermediary. But in that case, you do need a work permit. But jobs like delivery, Instacart, DoorDash, and those kinds of jobs, you don't. And a lot of the advertising, like you're saying, happens through Facebook and through WhatsApp, and this is how people learn about the jobs and the intricacies of how to play with the algorithm and how to work with the algorithm. And so there's some research that is starting to go in that direction. I'm very interested in that because my recent, my past work is about with the intermediary in, and so now I'm looking at, now let's remove those people that connect you, and what happens, right? Do we see a more fair system? Are people less exploited? I don't know. I mean, it is still an algorithm and it's still run by someone, and so things like that.
I think we have time for one more. Go ahead.
So you did an amazing amount of research in this project. I wanted to see kind of how you thought about the ethical position you were in as a supervisor, and the role you were playing in the displacement. So how did you?
Yes, and thank you for that. The book has a methods chapter where I go, in a lot of detail on that, because it's such a hard thing, okay? It was one of the hardest things of writing and doing this project, because it's not the ethics of being a supervisor is not something to be trivialized, okay? And I had a very difficult time deciding that I was going to stay there, and I managed it the way I could manage it, and that was by, one, really establishing a clear line in terms of what is the line that I'm not going to cross, okay? And one of the things, that line I wasn't going to cross is like, I'm not going to fire people, I'm not going to hire people, okay? And at that point, one of the jobs that I ended up dropping, which was the mill, they wanted me to start engaging in, take the place of another person to be promoted to be a supervisor. And I said, I'm not gonna do this. And that was gonna be my comparative case. And I decided not to do it because ethically I just could not do that. But then the supervising aspect is another key question. You know, you're here in a power situation working with people that are reporting to you. Now, the supervisor in this kind of jobs is just one step removed from being a line worker, okay? You're not making managerial decisions. I mean, you are running a line, but you're not making personnel decisions. And I was hired essentially as a cultural broker more than anything. And the way I kind of was able to see myself in the mirror and wake up and not feel terrible every day when I went to do this research was by knowing that I knew the people I was supervisor by having worked in the worst jobs with them, okay? The dynamic of these industries or these jobs is that I was with the same workers I was supervisor. I had been in a situation where we were cleaning toilets together, okay? And I happened because of bilingualism to now being in a supervisory position, but our relationship was not that hierarchical, okay? And I tried to maintain that as horizontally as possible. It was more like an aide who can, interpret and translate than somebody who's giving orders, okay? And when I was put in a position of you need to write people up, it's like, oh, sorry, I need to go translate here, okay? And I will just walk away to not take that position of the actual hierarchical supervisory role. But I had to manage it because I wanted to collect the data. And part of collecting the data was still doing the functions of the supervisor, right? I mean, doing the work. And so it wasn't easy. And it is something that I would not recommend people to do. Do not try that at home because I would not do that again. But it is something that I need to be honest, and that it was a hard situation, and that is something that it will stay with me because it is an ethical fine line to do this kind of research. But yeah, thank you. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, but please join me in thanking Professor.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you.